Welcome to the PHP Essentials Training Series. In this tutorial we're going to talk about using programming loops in PHP, and this tutorial will focus on the for loop. In this tutorial we're going to discuss the for loop. Loops are used to loop through code and are an important part of any programming language. Loops allow us, in programming, to have repetitive functions or tasks performed over and over again based on the iterations of the loop. You'll see as we go through this demonstration that we can actually control how many times we actually walk through these particular loops. And the tasks, although they're repetitive, they may not be exactly the same, as variable content can change, and actually slight variations in the task itself can change based on the loop count or how we work ourselves through these iterations of that loop. So the first thing we're going to do is let's look at the HTML form that we're going to use as we demonstrate the for loop in this particular tutorial. Alright, so what we're going to do, we're going to go in and we're going to look at the HTML form that we're going to create in order to demonstrate the for loop for us. So let's drop out of my presentation here, and I've got my Sublime Text 2 text editor open. I'm also logged into my local host, the root of my web server, and again you should be running your WAMP server as we work through these exercises because you'll need that host to check the stuff that we're actually programming and doing. If you don't have your WAMP server involved for the tutorial, under the tools section of the website there is a tutorial on how to install a WAMP server. So the first thing I want to do is I want to build my basic HTML5 document. So instead of having you guys watch me type all this in, I'm just going to go ahead and paste it in. I'm going to save this, again saving this in the root of my WAMP server. So it's in the www directory, and I'm going to call this, we'll just call it the for loop .html, because this is our HTML document and it's in the for loop. And if we refresh now, you'll see that I've got that up in my browser window. And all I've actually done is I've created my doc type HTML. That's my HTML5 doc type. I've got my open and closing HTML tags, opening and closing head tags, my open and closing body tags, and in the title I've put using the for loop. That will become the tab name for the title page of the page that we're creating. And in my body I've got a H3 heading called using the for loop in PHP, and I'm actually going to add another H4 heading underneath that because we're going to actually do two separate loops here. I'm going to call this the simple loop, and then I'm going to go ahead and close out that H4 tag because I actually want to demonstrate two different types of loops, or two different ways of doing loops here. So we're going to do a simple loop first, and then we're going to demonstrate a little more complex loop. If I save that document and I go ahead and load it in my browser window, you'll see using our for loops in PHP, we've got our H3 heading and our H4 heading, and our titles now displayed against or across our tab. So now that we've started to set up the HTML page, the next thing we're going to do is go build the form itself that's going to store the data for our for loop. Okay, so we've got our basic page set up. Now we actually have to go build our form. So the first thing I'm going to do, and again, so you don't have to watch me typing, I'm going to be bringing this in from the code example file that's part of the exercise files for this tutorial. You can actually purchase those exercise files through the OnTarget store for this particular tutorial, or look at the link below this video. And the first thing I want to do is I want to put in my form itself, my form tag. That's going to be a method post. And the action is actually going to go into a scripts directory, which we haven't created yet, and we're going to load a file called the formloop.php file, which actually we have not created yet either. Let me go ahead and increase this font size a little bit. Makes it a little bit easier for y'all to read. Okay, so we've got our method post in. Whenever we do an opening tag, we want to get our closing tag in. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that in right below this, so we make sure that we've got that tag as part of our body. So we've got our opening and closing tags in. Let's go ahead and save this form. Now what I need to do is I need to start building the form itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a place inside this form where we can enter staff names, staff member names for this particular application. So I'm going to go ahead and create a P tag. And I'm going to come right below, and I'm going to indent, create a P tag, and I would say enter staff names here. And now I'm actually going to put in input fields so we can actually input these staff names. So the first one is going to be, I'm going to put in a BR tag that's going to give us a carriage return, which is going to give us a line break. Input type is going to be a text type. The name for this particular one is staff 1, and I want it 30 characters long. So that's just telling me how long that text box is going to be inside my browser window. And now I'm going to go ahead and select this whole thing, and I'm going to paste this. Let's paste this 5 more times. And now I'm going to go ahead and say this is going to be number 2. This is going to be number 3. This will be number 4. This will be number 5. And this will be number 6. I'm going to do the same thing with my staff or my ID name. I'm going to make this one staff 2, staff 3, staff 4, staff 5, and staff 6. And then what I want to do is I want to go ahead and close out this P tag. So right below here, remember we opened up a P tag here and I don't have my closing tag yet. So I'm going to come right down here and I'm going to close out that P tag, my paragraph tag. And then right below that, I want to put a submit button. Because again, as part of my form, I've got to have a way to submit this into my for loop PHP file. So I'm going to put an input type submit with a value equals submit data. That's going to be the actual text that appears on the button itself, submit data. So real quickly, let me go ahead and save this, and let's talk about what we just did real quick. First off, we created a form in our HTML document. Notice we have the open and closing tag. The form method is going to be a post. There's 2 different methods we can use in forms in HTML, post and get. Whenever you're dealing with forms, most of the time it's going to be post. Probably 99% of the time it's a post, because you're actually posting something back to a database or back to a file. And then in the action, I've actually told it when you hit the submit button, when I type this submit, I want you to go into the scripts directory and run the forloop.php file. That's going to be where our for loop is, and that's going to be what's working with this data that we're creating here. And then I just enter the staff member names, and I've given myself 6 input text fields, each with a unique name to actually input these staff member names with. So keep in mind, very, very important concept here. The name of this is unique because this is how we're passing that data into the PHP file. Each field is going to have its unique name, but this one's going to be staff 1, staff 2, staff 3, staff 4, staff 5, and staff 6. And you'll see that when we get to the other form, how we pull that data out. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And if I refresh this browser window, you should see what our form looks like now that we've finished creating it. And this is the form that we're going to use as we're working with this for loop. So the next thing we want to do, let's talk a little bit about what we've done. So let's discuss our HTML form. The first thing in this form is hard-coded in the HTML document. We actually wrote all the code in an HTML document. Keep in mind, a lot of this could have been produced dynamically using a for loop and using a database table. And we'll demonstrate that in future tutorials, but we actually hard-coded everything into our form. Understand the difference between the input type and the name, and if you remember correctly, we talked a little bit about that. This input type is a text field. So the type is text. The name is the actual unique name for this particular data cell. So that staff position 1 right there has a unique name of staff 1. Staff 2 will have a unique name of staff 2. Those are unique to that particular cell as it passes data back and forth. And let's understand the attributes, methods, and actions, and we talked about those. Remember I told you that we have 2 attributes inside this form. We have a method attribute with post. We can usually have post or get. Normally when we're using forms, we're posting data back to a database, so they're going to be post. And the action is what's going to happen when we press the submit button. It's actually going to go into a directory called scripts, and it's going to load the forloop.php file, which we're getting ready to create. And I think we've covered most everything we need to do, so now let's go ahead and build our scripts directory and continue working with our tutorial. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do in our tutorial is we're going to build that scripts directory that we refer to in that HTML file we just created. So I'm going to go ahead and open up C Programs WAMP directory. This is the directory for our WAMP application that we've got running on our desktop. I want to go in the www directory. This is that HTML file that we just created. In there I want to create a new folder, and I want to call it scripts. And that's where we're going to put our PHP files that we're getting ready to create. So we want to create that scripts folder. It's going to hold the PHP files that we create for the tutorial. So what we've just done is inside the root directory of the WAMP server, or the www directory, I've actually come off that directory and created a new folder called scripts. Inside that root directory, we have that HTML file. We can store HTML or PHP files inside that root directory. And if you remember correctly, we actually have a file stored in our root directory. It's the forloop.html file that we were just working on. That's where we created that form. That's in that www root directory. So we've created that file, we've created the script directory, and now we're getting ready to create the forloop.php file, which is going to reside in that scripts directory. You'll find as you go through my tutorials, I use a lot of directory structures inside the root directory of my servers to keep my files organized, and it makes it a lot easier to maintain the websites that I design. So I do this quite often. I'm always making directories inside the root server, or the root directory, in order to keep things organized as I work through my files. So the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to start going in now and looking at the syntax of the for loop in PHP. Alright, so before we actually start creating our code, our PHP code block, let's go ahead and discuss the syntax of the for loop so everybody understands exactly, as we start putting this code in and saving the files, you understand exactly why and what we're doing and why we're doing it the way we are. The first thing we do for any PHP code block is we actually start out with an opening and a closing PHP tag. So we're going to have our less than sign, our question mark PHP, and then the closing tag is going to be a question mark and a greater than sign. So in order to add a PHP code block to any HTML document, there's a couple things we have to do. The first thing we have to do is we have to save that as a .php file in the actual file name. And the next thing we have to do is we have to include a code block for the PHP code. So that's what we're doing right here with the opening and closing PHP tags. Now for our for loop, what we want to do is we want to use our keyword for, and then we have three statements inside parentheses. First, we're going to declare a variable that I'm going to use as a counter, and I'm going to call that variable I, and I'm going to give that assign it a value equal to 1 first time through. Then I'm going to check the value of I and see if is it less than or equal to 6. And keep in mind, from our previous example, we built our form with 6 fields. That's where I'm getting the 6 from. Normally that would be a dynamic value, but for our demonstration we've hard-coded that form so it's not dynamic, so we actually know that the value is 6. We're putting that 6 in here. So is I less than or equal to 6? If it is, if this evaluates true, we're going to run the code between these two curly braces. Anything that's there, whether it's 1 line or 500 lines of code, is going to be executed as long as this evaluates to true. So for this particular example, we're going to print a line number with a hash sign and a colon, and then we're going to print the value of our variable. So for the first time through, we're going to print 1. Then we're going to put in a line break. It's going to come back, and it's going to iterate that value of I by 1. It's going to add 1 to it. That's what my I++ is. It adds 1 to the current value. Comes back and looks again. Is I less than or equal to 6? The second time through, it's going to be 2. So this is going to evaluate true again. It's going to drop down, execute the code between the curly braces, then come back up and iterate or add to the value of I. So the next time through, it's going to be 3. Going to look through this value again. Is it less than or equal to 6? The third time through, it's going to be 3. Keep in mind, it only goes through here the first time through when we initiate the variable and assign it a value. From then on, it goes through and evaluates the value, and after it evaluates the value, executes what's between the curly braces, it comes and executes the last step in the for loop, which is to iterate that value. We always want to make certain that we add to the value in the for loop because we don't want to get into an endless loop or an infinite loop. By going into the I++, we're iterating that value, we're adding to it. By adding 1 to it, we're bringing that I variable up 1 each time we pass through the curly braces and execute the code. So I hope that kind of explains what we're getting ready to do as we build our PHP code block for our demonstration. This is pretty much a standard PHP for loop. Again, we assign a value to a variable, usually a counter variable. We evaluate whether or not the variable is true. Is it less than or equal, in this case 6? If the variable is true, or if the value is true, we execute the code between the curly braces. Once that's executed, we come on up and we iterate or add to that variable value so we don't get ourselves into an infinite loop. Eventually, the I variable is going to be either 6 or greater than 6. Once that occurs, this evaluates false, and it actually drops out of these curly braces and executes anything that's after that for loop. In this case, there'd be nothing there, so it would actually just drop out of the PHP code block and finish the rest of the form. So I hope that explains what we're getting ready to type in for our code. But I wanted to explain to you exactly how a for loop works before we actually enter the code into our PHP code block. Okay, so let's go ahead and create that first PHP file. Let's go ahead and drop out of our presentation. If you remember from where we left off, we created our HTML file. We've got our form now created that we're going to submit this data to. So what I need is I need a new file, and I'm going to save this as, and this is where this name becomes very important. Remember, we called it the forloop.php. That's what this file is going to become. So we're going to save this as, save in my scripts directory, the forloop.php, because that's the file that we're calling. Remember when we hit that submit button right here? That's the file we're calling, the for loop, and it's in that scripts directory. So if I go back here and I refresh this screen, there's the for loop that we just created in that scripts directory. Okay, so let's go adding some code to that. So as to save some time, I'm just going to go ahead and put in my basic code. This is the basic doc type code that we're using for our HTML5 documents. I'm going to go ahead and save this. If you remember right here, I had a simple loop under here. So we're going to get our opening h4 tag. And I'm just going to say a simple for loop. And then I'm going to close that h4 tag. And now right below that, we're going to start building that for loop inside of our file. Alright, so we've got our form set up. Now we're going to go ahead and do our simple form loop, or for loop, so we can so I can demonstrate to you exactly how this for loop is going to work. We're going to do a simple one first, then we're going to go and do the one that actually reads the data from this form that we just generated. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and open up my PHP tags like we talked about in the presentation. So I put my greater than sign, my my question mark in PHP. I come down a couple of lines, question mark, less than sign, and that closes the PHP block. So now we actually have a PHP block that's part of this form that we're writing, this actual HTML document that we're writing, that's going to display our data when we hit the submit data button. Now let's go ahead and put in that for loop. I'm just going to go ahead and bring this in. We'll talk about this as we get it in, so you don't have to watch me type. This is the same for loop that we demonstrated or we talked about inside our presentation. So let's go in real quick and talk about what we're doing here. I'm going to go ahead and save this document. But we start out the for loop with our keyword for, then we have our open and closing parentheses, and inside our for loop we have three statements. There's three parts to this for loop. First, we initiate and declare our variable I, which is, we're going to use that as our counter. So we set that up as an I variable. By the way, this could be anything, doesn't have to be I. A lot of people use double I's or double J's, double K's. It just depends how large your application is and if you'll be searching for this variable. I tend to use I because most of my applications are relatively small in PHP because I keep them in their own separate blocks. Or I'll write standalone functions, as you'll see as you go through my tutorials. So the first thing we do is we declare the variable and we assign it a value of 1. Then I go in and I look, is the variable I less than or equal to 6? If it's less than or equal to 6, I execute the code that's between these two curly braces. For this particular instance, I just have one line of code. It's a print statement. It's going to print a line number with a colon, and then it's going to print the value of that variable. So that's cool. And then I'm going to put in an HTML line break, so it goes down to the next line. So if I is less than or equal to 6, it comes down and executes this code. It's in between the curly braces. Then it comes back up and it iterates I to 2. So now the next time we go through this for loop, because keep in mind it's going to keep going through this until this evaluates to false. If I is less than or equal to 6, it's going to evaluate to true. So it's working very, very similar to our if statements. As long as that's evaluating to true, it's going to execute the code that's in between the curly braces. As soon as it evaluates to false, it's going to drop out of those curly braces and come down here and execute whatever other codes below that for loop, or the rest of the HTML form, whatever's going on with this particular form that we're writing or page that we're writing. So it comes down, it executes this code, comes back up. It only sets this the very first time through the for loop, never goes back and does that again. So remember, we're doing everything from right to left, just as we've talked about with our if statements. It checks the value of I. If it evaluates to true, it runs the code, comes back, iterates the value of I, checks the value once again, say, okay, is I less than or equal to 6? On the second pass through, it would now be 2. So it would come down and run this code again and again. It's going to do that until that value in the center statement, until it evaluates to false. What we're going to do is I'm going to show you what I mean by this. I'm just going to type another print statement here. This is going to basically be a debug statement. And I'm just going to put in here the value of I, our variable I, and this is basically just going to show you that once we get this, once I value gets to 7, it's going to drop out of this for loop. So it's going to drop out of the curly braces and come and execute the rest of this code. We end all of our statements with a semicolon. Let's go ahead and save this for loop. Now let's go back in, and we're going to actually run this application from here. Remember, on our for loop HTML page, which is the form page right here, we've called the forloop.php file, which is located in our scripts directory. If we go back here and we look in that scripts directory, remember the forloop.php is inside that directory. We're calling that when we hit the submit button. So once we hit that submit button, we're going to call this little application that we've just written that's located in that directory. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the submit, and you'll notice now with each iteration through the code, the line number is printed with the value of I. So the first time we go through, we're printing number 1, then number 2, then number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6. And you'll notice when we get to 7, we drop out of the for loop and execute whatever is remaining code that's on that page, or just stop execution altogether. In this particular case, everything's done. We printed the value of I, and we stopped. So that gives you an idea how the for loop's working. Remember, 3 different parts separated by semicolons. There is no semicolon for the last portion. Enclosed in parentheses, anything inside the curly braces is going to be executed as long as this evaluates to true. We're going to go ahead and do a little bit more complex for loop in the next demonstration. We're actually going to use our form and input these names, and that's going to go through and generate the names for us in the for loop. Okay, picking up right where we left off, you'll notice I'm still looking at my for loop. I'm still looking at my document, my HTML form, which is the actual presentation page for this particular demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and save this under a different name. Do a save as. And again, I'm doing this so that we can keep these things separate if you've downloaded the exercise file, so that you can actually go through this step by step. I'm going to save this with an _1. Keep in mind that when we change the name of this application, in order for this form to work correctly, we've got to go back and update the form as to what application it's calling. So I'm going to go give it the same _1 that we just gave that application and save the changes to that form. So now when I call this form, once I refresh it, it's going to call that new one that we're working on and not the original that we had just demonstrated in the previous exercise. Alright, so what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up another PHP block of code, because we're going to do a little bit more complex for loop on this one. And this time I actually want to go in and read the data that we're inputting on this form using our for loop. Read that data and display it when we submit hit our submit button. So let me go ahead and bring this code in so that you can see what I've done here. Let's clean this up a little bit. I always do my indenting. Makes it a lot easier to understand what we're doing here if we keep our code in some type of reasonable format. Alright, I'm going to print that staff member. Let's go ahead and bring this in. So a closing brace, that's our opening and closing brace. Remember, anything that's in between the curly braces executes as long as our evaluation is true. I'm going to go ahead and add some spaces in this. White space does not make a difference, by the way, in what we're doing here. I'm just doing this so it's easier for y'all to see what's going on. Keep in mind again, just as we talked about earlier, the first time into our for loop, I'm going to set a variable of I. I'm going to give it a value of 1. Very first time through. It's only going to do that the first time through the for loop. And then it's going to look at our I is less than or equal to 6. It's going to determine whether that is true or false. If it's true, it's going to go ahead and execute the code, come back up. It's going to iterate the value of I by adding 1 to it. If you've been going through the tutorials with me, you'll understand that I++ just adds 1 to the current value. And then it's going to go back and reevaluate it again, and it's going to continue to run that for loop until this evaluates to false, just as we talked about in the last exercise. The difference here is I want you to understand that I'm actually setting up a variable inside my curly braces called staff name. And that's going to equal staff plus the value of I as we go through this. And let me explain to you where I got that from. If you remember when we set up our form, I told you we had 6 unique names in these text boxes. And there they are: staff 1, staff 2, staff 3, staff 4, staff 5, and staff 6. Those are unique to each individual text box that's in our form. What I'm doing here is I'm saying my staff name is equal to the post variable that I'm sending in. When I actually call this by hitting the submit button, I'm actually posting these values to this form. And that's what this is right here. Or I say staff equal post staff name. It's looking at the post variable that I'm bringing in from that HTML form and assigning it the value of staff. And then it's printing that value with my staff member and then giving me a line break. So I'm reading the post values as they come in, I'm assigning it, and then I'm going down to the next one. So the first time through, it's going to read staff 1. It's going to iterate that I value. Then it's going to go look for staff 2, staff 3, and so on. And it's getting those from these names that we gave those text boxes. So I wanted you to understand that. I mean, that's an important concept of how this is working, because we're actually passing those values in from this form. So let's go ahead and save this form. And now let's go back to our HTML form and let's enter a couple names. I'm just going to enter a few names into this form. So I've entered Mike, Steve, Paul, Mary, and George. And keep in mind now we updated the HTML form to reflect the new PHP form that we're calling the form1_1 loop. So when I hit the submit button, I should be calling this new PHP application, which is going to run both my for loops, both the one we did for the earlier presentation. Let me clean this up a little bit. For our earlier presentation, and we're going to call our new for loop. And actually, you know what? Let's go print a couple of line breaks in here so that these things aren't one on top of the other. We're going to give that HTML5 line break command. So we get a couple of blank lines between what we did earlier and what we're doing now. It's just going to give us 3 blank lines before we actually start running this PHP command. I'm going to go ahead and save that. So I've got my names entered. When I hit the submit button, I'm going to run my earlier loop. There's the one that we did in the earlier presentation. You'll notice this one, now we've brought in the name values that we had on the form itself, both the Mike, Steve, Paul, Mary, and George. And those were brought in using that for loop, but again, iterating through it. Notice that even though we didn't have a value in that 6th field, it still brought the field in because we still had that field sent over. It was just sent over with no data. So it still came in as value number 6, but no data was assigned to it, so it just left the value blank. So there was technically no staff member in there. So it came in as a blank text field. So I hope that explains how for loops work. I hope you have a good concept now of how for loops work. They're used a lot in PHP. We're going to go into a couple other different loops, as you'll see in the Essential Training Series, but I wanted you to have a good grasp of how for loops work in PHP, because we use them quite often. You'll see as we walk through a lot of the tutorials. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I look forward to your feedback.